Today is November 19th, and we are continuing our discussion with Jack Russell, class of 1944, about his relationship with Randolph-Macon College as part of the Living Legacies Oral History Project. Sarah Hendrick and Lori Preston are with us again today. Thank you for coming back.
I'm glad to.
We appreciate it. We mostly covered the Randolph-Macon years, and so what we want to talk about today are some of the other things you've done in your life and with Randolph-Macon. But I do understand there were a couple of stories that you remembered after you left that we were going to talk about first, having to do with the fish caps.
Yes. After we finished, it occurred to me, or I remembered, that when I was the 3 years that I was here, that of course there were no cars, or very few cars. So if we wanted to go anywhere, I'd take my fish cap, go down to the highway, put that on, and put up my thumb, and in about 5 minutes I'd have a ride, either way, north or south. And I got some interesting rides. I was going north one time, and a gentleman stopped, nice-looking guy, good car, and asked me if I was going up, and I told him yes. And I got in, and after I closed the door and got in, I looked down. There was a pistol strapped to his waist. Come to find out, he was an agent with the Secret Service or the Treasury Department, and I was perfectly safe. But it still was a little disconcerting. But I thought it was interesting that you could catch a ride almost anywhere then. You can't now, but that was the best way of moving around.
Well, thank you. Armed rides, that's a new one. After you left the college, where did you go? What happened in your life?
Well, you mean immediately after I left?
Sure.
Okay. I left in June of '43, at the end of my junior year. The Navy saw fit to call us all up. I was in a Navy unit that was supposed to be allowed to stay in school until we graduated. But they called us up a year early and sent us all down to the University of Richmond, where they had a naval school. They were setting up a unit. And I had 1 semester down there. And then I was sent to Notre Dame to midshipman school for 60 days. And came out of there with very little knowledge except the traditions in the Navy. And served for a while in a Philadelphia Navy Yard prior to going to Harvard to the Navy Supply School. And that was conducted at the Harvard Business School. And from there, I went down to Camp Perry for about 6 months, after which I was sent to California on my way to Okinawa. At that point in time, Okinawa was being established, or it was established, to be the jumping off point for the invasion of Japan. So they had a big supply base there. The thing is that while I was in California, just before I left, they dropped the bombs, and the war ended rather abruptly. The Navy, in its good traditions, stopped all the materials they were going to send over there, but sent all the men. So we went over there, and I stayed there about 3 or 4 months and came back and was discharged in February of 1946. I worked for about a year, and then Dr. Simpson, who was the dean up here, T. McNider Simpson, was kind enough to accept all the credits I earned at the University of Richmond. And then I took 1 year of Spanish, which is all I needed, down there, and worked part-time. And he accepted that also. So I as far as I know, I'm the only one that has graduated up here without attending any class. I got my degree with the with the class of '47, and then entered law school at Washington and Lee, and they had an expedited curriculum. Then they were running 3 semesters a year, 3 full semesters a year, which meant that when one ended, the next one started almost immediately. We got about 10 days to 2 weeks off in June, and then that was it, rather than Christmas and a couple of days between the semesters. And I finished there and was fortunate enough to pass the bar exam the first time. And I had no intention of going to practice law. When I figured it was a good place to go, a good stepping stone to most anything. But while I was in school, I decided I wanted to practice law. And finding a place was not easy then. This was 1949. I ended up out in Lee County, which is that last little county in southwest Virginia, the very tip end of the state. I spent my summers out there when I was growing up, and my father and mother both came from there. And from our house in Richmond to our house out there, at that time, it was 400 miles, which is further than it is from Richmond to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And I was out there about 6 months, made a little bit, enough to survive. The economy wasn't good. And then to top it all off, John L. Lewis, which most of you all don't even know. John L. Lewis was the head of the Coal Miners Union. Southwest Virginia's economy was divided between 2 things, coal mining and farming. And if the coal mines shut down for any reason, the farmers quit spending money. So you couldn't pry a nickel out of that place. John L. Lewis called the coal miners out in November, before Thanksgiving. And they were out for 50 days, or 52 days, before he arrived at a settlement with the coal miner owners. And during that time, I decided to come back to Richmond. My mother was up here, and I worked for about 2.5 years at the state tax department, the whole time looking for a place to practice law. And I finally found one in February of '52 and started practicing law with an attorney named Jack Browder. And he and I started a firm, and that lasted for 39 years when it just suddenly imploded. They broke up and groups went everywhere. But I thoroughly enjoy the practice.
What type of law did you practice? Did you have a specialty?
Yes. I didn't start out that way, but I went into litigation, and that's what Jack Browder did. We defended insurance companies, mostly automobile cases, and I got my initial experience in that. And then about 1959 or somewhere along that period of time, we got in from one of the insurance companies our first malpractice case. We hadn't had any before then. And of course, he was the experienced attorney. He took it and tried it, and was successful. And another one, about 6 months later, came in, and he said, "Why don't you prepare this case, and I'll sit with you." And I did, and we were successful again. And when it was all over with, he said, "If any more of these things come in, you can have them." He, for some reason, didn't like them. And that was the beginning of what I turned out to be a specialty. I defended medicine and thoroughly enjoyed it. Learned a lot of medicine. Sometimes more than I wish I knew.
And in that time period, you've been involved with the college on a number of levels. How did you stay involved with Randolph-Macon?
You know, I've thought about this, and I cannot remember specifically what it was and when. I know about when. It was probably in the late 50s, maybe early 60s. But it had to be very early because I was president of the Alumni Society from 63 to 65. And I had gotten involved up here and knew Lambeth Clark, who was then vice president of development, and Roddy Jones, who was alumni secretary. And then there was a young man named Jim Bergdahl, who was here as an assistant in development. And as I said, it developed into the fact that I became president of the Alumni Society. And from then on, you know, I've been involved almost constantly, one way or another. The 2 years I was president of the Alumni Society were interesting. That was during that time, that 2 years, Dr. Moreland decided to retire. And because I was president of the Alumni Society, well, at that time, the process for finding a new president was the trustees appointed a committee. And it was composed of 3 trustees, 3 faculty, and 3 alumni. And I got to choose the alumni and picked Luther White, who was a very good friend of mine and who had gone to law school with me, and Dick Irby, who was a senior my freshman year and was captain of the football team and a great guy. And the 9 of us looked around and interviewed a lot of people, and we weren't having a lot of success. And we were meeting one day at the downtown club in Richmond, and Purnell Bailey was on the committee. And when Luther left the room, Purnell said, "You know, we've got the person right here in our room in his meeting," and said it was Luther. And that was the beginning. And I can't remember now how we managed it to keep him out of it. I do recall that after we finally made a decision, that is the other 8 people, Dick Irby and I were delegated to talk him into it. And we succeeded at that, and he became president of Randolph-Macon. My next involvement in that respect began in 1975 when I went on the Board of Trustees. I was on the Board of Trustees for 8 years. And during that time, there was some, let's put it this way, there were some disconnects or discord between the administration and the trustees. We didn't see eye to eye. And it was during that time that Luther decided to retire. And I was not on the committee that interviewed and selected Liddell Payne, but I was on the board. And it was an interesting period of time to be on the board. Mm-hmm. Very trying. Luther was a good friend of mine, and I was very sorry to see it end up the way it did. I guess as far as this is concerned, that is
It
sufficient.
was a very difficult time in the college, but a lot of other things besides, and we tend to focus on Luther leaving, but there were a lot of other things that happened as well, because we integrated and we went coeducational in that period as well, which in the long run have had a much bigger impact on the college than a
Oh,
change
yes.
of administration.
And I have thought that since then, that probably the best thing he did for the school was to take it coeducational. He did some other good things, but that is probably the outstanding one, because had he not done that, it's questionable whether the school would have survived. And he told me one day that after he decided to do it, and he had checked with faculty and alumni and trustees enough to be satisfied that it would pay, everybody would back it, or the majority would back it. He said he went over to Ed Cox's office. Ed Cox was director of admissions then. Went over to Ed Cox's office and said, "Ed, I want 50 girls here by September." Ed said, "This September?" And they got him. So it worked.
Can you tell us a little bit about that process? I mean, and it does, in our record, it looks like Luther just made up his mind we were going co-ed, and we did. And I know there were other things that went on behind that. There's a backstory to that.
I wasn't involved in that, so all I have is secondhand information. And I agree with you, at the time it seemed rather abrupt that he just decided to do it and did it. He told me much later that he had consulted with the three main groups that would be involved: the faculty and the trustees and the alumni. And no one of those really objected. So he decided to do it. And how much he consulted, I can't tell you. Experiencing Luther on the trustees, I can understand why people felt it was an abrupt decision. And to some extent it may have been. Luther was inclined to think that whatever he wanted to do was right. And he was a dear friend of mine, but that he had a few shortcomings, like all of us do. And that was one of them.
And to back up a little bit, before we went coeducational, the college integrated. Was that a upheaval on the Board of Trustees, or is that...
I wasn't on the board then. And they had already gone coeducational and already integrated. I went on the board in 1975. All this occurred several years before that. And frankly, the fact that it had integrated didn't, I don't think, create as much, I hate to use the word ruckus, but disturbance among some factors as the coeducational decision did.
That's, from the college record, it looks like integration was much smoother.
Mm-hmm. I think it was.
It was necessary, and they did it.
Mm-hmm.
And moved on,
Mm-hmm.
where the women stirred up a lot more controversy. And that was how it felt.
Mm-hmm. Yes, oh yes. There were some alumni who were just absolutely bitter about the decision to go co-ed. They think but a men's school. even though all through the years there have always been several female students here. In 1944, 1940 to 1943, while I was here, there were 3 or 4. And so, with that background, going all the way didn't make that much difference to me. We'd always had women in class, a woman or two in our classes, and so it didn't disturb me that much.
Were there any, other than presidential administration, were there big changes when you were on the Board of Trustees? What were some of the projects that were undertaken?
I can't remember all of them. I can recall more about who the people were than I can what all the decisions were, although I remember very vividly that there were a lot. When I came on the board, I was put on the nominations committee, and Purnell Bailey was the chairman. And we, of course, had to consider all the recommendations for honorary degrees and of that type, and new trustees and things like that. He was chairman the first year, then he left the board, and they made me chairman. And I had always felt, and still do, that at least in those years, that, I guess it's right to put this in here, Randolph-Macon was overly generous with their honorary degrees as far as the clergy was concerned. It almost appeared that if a minister became district superintendent, he automatically got a DD degree, whether there were any other qualifications or not. In the committee, we discussed from the very beginning the qualifications and the criteria for getting honorary degrees. And they were different, or they were being applied differently to non-clergy and clergy. We looked a lot more carefully at the qualifications for a layperson than we did the clergy. And I didn't like it. Didn't think it was right. And when I became chairman of the committee, we basically stopped giving DD degrees. There were ministers on the board, and they didn't really argue about it too much in the board meetings. When the committee came back and reported that what they were doing, let's see, Jim Turner and Bernard Via and Bill Wright, and there may have been one or two others, were on the board. And I don't remember getting any great opposition. That went on for several years while I was chairman. And I think they're a little more careful now even than they were then. But, to me, you have to do something on you outstanding, or be outstanding in some way, and going above and beyond what the ordinary person would think a person in that capacity would do. Just doing your job was not enough. And yet, that's what was happening, and that was all. And I had one of them come up to me afterward, couple of years afterward and said he really appreciated what I was doing because it made his degree much more valuable to him. There were other things. We were always worried about the budget. It was really nip and tuck in those days. We got into some serious discussions during that period of time about tenure. We had some real serious discussions about tenure. There was a substantial group on the board that was in favor of getting rid of it because at that time there were several members of the faculty that were just automatically being promoted or having raises that really didn't do anything other than go to class. And I remember that George Oliver was the faculty representative, I think, on the board. And we got into some heated discussions with him. Because George, who was an excellent teacher and went way beyond what you'd ordinarily required, adamantly defended the process. And I couldn't understand it. That here's a man who's outstanding, and he is perfectly willing to go overboard and defend all those guys who were borderline competent. I hope it had some salutary effect, even though we didn't get around to abolishing it. But it was seriously discussed, and I was among those who was willing to get rid of it. I thought that promotions ought to be on merit only, and raises ought to be on merit only. If you didn't do any more than just go to class and teach, give them a little raise, but not much. Not anything of any consequence. But we talked about it and didn't do anything.
You said you remember the people more than the projects. Who were some of the movers and shakers?
The chairman of the board was Jimmy Butler. And I understood that he had been gotten on the board by Luther. But Jimmy did a good job. Jimmy was not an educated person. His son later went here, but Jimmy himself, the original first Jimmy Sr., was not an educated person. He was a self-made man. And of course, as chairman, he was influential. Jim Turner was a very good member of the board. John Werner was on the board at that time. There was a man named Wilmer Mackey who was a member of Trinity, as I was at the time. And he was an outstanding person. He was one of them. I didn't sit around and listen. I was trying to think who else was on the board at the time. During the time I was there, we got a man named, his name slips my mind now. He was, at that time, vice president of finance for Reynolds Metals, and was a very, very good Methodist.
Craigie? Is it Walter Craigie?
No, Craigie came on the board all that time.
His father.
This was
Senior.
another man. Craigie was investment banking.
Yeah, his father, though, was a big guy at Reynolds Metals.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
His father was?
Yes, sir. I worked with, yes.
I don't remember who the
Davis was his last name.
Yeah.
Good friend of mine at the time. But he was one. He was chairman of the finance committee. And there were others that came on. By and large, no one on the board just came on there and sat on their hands. Most everybody participated. It was a much, much smaller board than it is now. I was in a committee meeting recently in the boardroom, in the Mullins room, and saw that big U-shaped table. And when I was on the board, there was just one long table, about half the size, or less than half the size of the one that's there now. Right at the end of my time, I can't think of her first name, McGraw-Page. McBroom, June McGraw-McBroom came on the board through the efforts of Jim Turner. She was a member of South Roanoke United Methodist Church, and Jim had been her pastor. So he knew her history and background. And he said that we ought to have her on the board. And they agreed and elected her, and she took it. That's the beginning of this building. Interesting story about that, if you can deviate a minute. She was had gone to school at Hollins, but had not graduated. And at that time, Hollins didn't, as far as alumni activities were concerned, didn't recognize non-graduates. And after she was put on the board up here, she was put on the board of Roanoke College. She gave them a library. And my wife, through other connections, knew the president of Hollins. And she was very upset with the previous policy. She said, that's the last time we'll do that. We're going to recognize everybody who went through the door up here. Because she saw they had missed a library by not recognizing non-graduates. And non-graduates up here have been significant down through the years. The one I remember most right now is a man named Pratt, who was, I think, at Fredericksburg at the time. But he was the Pratt of Pratt & Whitney engines for General Motors. And
Walter Lee,
James Lee.
James Lee.
James Lee Pratt.
but I thought it was interesting that they changed their policy at Hollins.
You've mentioned several connections with the church through the years, and I know you've been active in various parts of the Methodist Church. Can you tell us about your relationship with the church?
That really began in 1950 when I came back to Richmond and joined Trinity. From then on, I have been active at some time or other on every level of the church, from local church all the way through the general boards. I was president of the chairman of the General Board of Publication for 8 years. And that's the one that runs the Cokesbury bookstores, and at that time did all the printing for the church. They've gotten out of the printing business now. And I went to 3 general conferences, 2 or 3 jurisdictional conferences. One year I could have gone and didn't go because I was busy in the office and couldn't get out. I've, in the local church, done just about every, 1 or 2 of which I really shouldn't have been in at all, like being superintendent of the Sunday school. They couldn't find anybody else, so they gave it to me. But I've taught Sunday school, adult classes, and I enjoyed that. And was active in lay activities in the board here in the conference. I started to say, you name it, and I've done it, but it isn't quite that bad. I was the first, I think I was the first director of lay speaking for the conference. And all those were interesting experiences. But the church had meant a lot to me. And that's probably as much as one way, I guess, that I got on the board of trustees up here. I had been very active at Trinity. And Harry Eden had been on the board of trustees. And he went off the year I came on. And he had been responsible, I'm sure, for getting Wilma Mackey on the board. And Wilmer probably was as much responsible as anybody for my being on the board. I remember I was down in Norfolk trying a lawsuit and got a telephone call after the day was, after the trial day was over. It was Wilmer asking me if I'd be willing to serve on the board of trustees. And of course I was very honored to be asked. And told him I'd think about it and call him back. And I did. Back in those days, the church, the annual conference, had to elect or at least approve the trustees. And it was while I was on the board that was changed too. And I was one of those that was partly responsible for it, because I didn't like the idea that the church had the right to veto the board members. They never had, but it was just the principle of the thing. And we changed the Articles of Incorporation and took that out. And there was never any repercussion from it. I'm not even sure that the church ever knew about it. At least if they did, I never heard about it.
Now, I thought that was quite controversial, actually.
Well, I went to annual conference for over 20 years, and I honestly cannot recall that ever being discussed on the floor of the conference. I know that they, and it could have been, and I just wasn't at that session, at that particular session. I know every year there was a big discussion about alcohol and the colleges. Not just Randolph-Macon College here. I remember one year Dr. Quillian was the president of Randolph-Macon Women's College. And they had established a facility on the campus where the girls could go, take their dates, and they served 3.2 beer. And that created a ruckus on the conference floor you would never believe. And he stood his ground, and I was proud of him. He said, we did this because we didn't want the girls out riding around in cars and drinking, or where there was drinking. And if we provided a facility, then they'd stay here and stay out of cars. And as I said, he stood his ground. And there was a lot of talk, but nobody ever did anything. The conference didn't. They still got their money. And no matter how much they talked about Randolph-Macon, we got our money. So, and I wasn't a member of the annual conference. There was a big hoopla over this. And that may have been when it was, before I got there.
There was and I don't remember the year, there was a covenant that they wanted, the conference wanted all of the schools to sign.
I
And
heard something about that.
Liddell wouldn't sign it. And I think actually the only one who signed it was Randolph-Macon Academy in the end, but it was and they were all underage, so it didn't, but one of the provisions was that we would allow no alcohol on campus, including at faculty functions and things like that. But I remember it being a big controversy.
I
Around
can't remember that.
1980.
When?
I was at conference, so it was around 1980.
Okay. That was the last year I went. No, it wasn't either. Well, that was the last year. I went regularly, it's constantly, from 1960 to 1980. That's when I rotated off the Board of Publication. And I was a member of annual conference as a member of the Board of Publication. Then I was elected as a district member and went for 2 or 3 more years. I honestly cannot remember that. I know there have been controversies down through the years about alcohol in Randolph-Macon. There was a minister named Garland Hopkins. I never knew the man. I just heard about him. And this was before when I started going to conference. And he was one of the leaders of a movement to almost disconnect with Randolph-Macon because of alcohol on the campus. And yet the school had a rule at that time, no alcohol. That didn't mean there wasn't. But when I was up here, that was the rule. We were told, you can't have any alcohol on campus. And one of the first things I remember, I was joined Phi Delta Theta fraternity, was being over there one weekend, and there was a beer keg in one of the back rooms on the first floor of the house. And the faculty advisor was Gourlette Simpson. He knew what was going on. He just didn't say anything. It was not anywhere near what it is now. It didn't even compare. The main thing they had up here then was beer, and it was 3.2 then. So it ain't that way now.
You currently have a project you're working on with Boyden.
Yes. That came about in an unusual way. I had never been to Boyden the whole time, from the time I entered here until 1980, I guess about 85, maybe 86. A group of members of the Virginia Conference Historical Society decided or concluded that there were several sites in Southside Virginia that ought to be preserved. And there were significant sites. And my wife was one of those that was interested in getting started. I participated. I helped do it. And that helped form the foundation. They established a foundation called the Old Brunswick Circuit Foundation, 1800s. And at that time, the Brunswick Circuit took in a good part of Southside Virginia and part of northern North Carolina. And Francis Asbury came down here many times. He stayed with a family in just south of Lawrenceville by the name of Drumgoole. And they wanted to preserve that house. And then they, just out another side of Lawrenceville was a place where there was a school called Ebenezer Academy. Ebenezer Academy was a secondary level school. It was the first Methodist school in this country. The building is long since gone, but the foundation is there. And they wanted that as just a historical site. And then, of course, there's Randolph-Macon at Boydton. And they felt that that was worth trying to preserve. When I went down there the first time, and there's an attorney in Lawrence, in Boydton, by the name of Walter Bales. He says it's Bales in Boydton and Beals everywhere else. He's a graduate of William and Mary, but he's a very, very active Methodist and very interested in the Boydton campus. And he gave us a tour. And he knows more history down there than anybody I know of. And that got me interested. We started then an effort to try and preserve some, get a hold of some of that property. There are 3 brick buildings that are still in existence that were built in 1830. One of them was the President's home. That's still lived in. Another one was Stewart's Hall, which is where the students took their meals. It was in a separate building from the main building. And then there were the remains of the main building. At one time, they were all on one connected campus. When the state decided to build a bypass around Boydton, they built a 4-lane highway and took it right through what used to be the campus. So the remains of the main building are on one side of 58, and Stewart's Hall is right across the road. Our first efforts were really to aim toward getting Stewart's Hall. It's intact, being lived in by a physician who had fixed it up, and they didn't do anything significant to change it on the inside. I went over and so many times saw the remains of the old building. The man who owned that, still owns it, is a minister, not a Methodist, out in Colorado. His father was a member of the Virginia Conference, annual conference, minister, John McHenry. And he wasn't a graduate up here, so how he got interested in that, I don't know. But at one time, when the building was available for sale, to be bought, he bought it. And he and his wife fixed up part of it and lived in it. They'd spend their vacations down there in Boydton in the old building. This was the West Wing. And then they moved into a house that had been built there on the property by a previous owner, which was a black school. And they built a home for their headmistress. They moved over there and lived in that. When he died, his wife got the property and she gave it to her son, who is the minister in Colorado. And they don't give him a price. And so that's the way it was when I got involved in this. And one day, about 2 years ago, we heard that he was coming east and wanted to meet with a group of us about the property. So Patty and I and Actually, we took Robert Patterson with us because he never had seen it. And I said, come on, let's go. And Walter Bales were there on behalf of the foundation. And then there was a group from the Ruritan Club who are not interested in buying the property. They want to put a satellite campus on one end of the property. They think, and I can understand this, they think a satellite campus college would down there would keep some of the local students from leaving. They could get their college education there and not have to go away to get it, because when they go away to get it, they never come back. So, we were the ones that met with John and we told him what our plan was, Jack McHenry, and that was basically to kind of carry out his father's wishes for the property, to preserve it. And so he agreed to sell it to us. We have an option and are in the midst of a campaign, I guess you'd call it that, to raise the money to buy it. If we don't buy it, it's going to be gone. We already know of one or two people who are interested in getting it for commercial purposes. If that happens, they'll get a bulldozer in there and tear the rest of that building down and haul it away, and that'll be the end of it. So we think it's well worth doing. I do. So I'm pretty deeply involved in that.
No, I've seen the remains, but I don't think I have a idea in my head as to how much property is
There
with
are
it.
14 and a half acres
Okay.
in the tract. The remains of the building and the house are on the west end of the lot, west end of the property. So there's about 10 acres east of there. That's very good developable property. I mean, it's not completely flat, but it's almost. And it would make a good site for a satellite campus. You could put one building up there very easily. And there are one or two junior colleges, community colleges down there that could be used as a feeding base. But nevertheless, that's what there is, 14 and a half acres.
Does that include the cemetery?
No. Dr. Shelton is the doctor who owns Stewart's Hall. He has about 20 or 21 acres, and it's in two tracts, and there's about 6 acres in the back tract. And the cemetery is on that piece of property. The railroad used to go right behind it. They built all the cottages in those days on the railroads, because that was the main means of transportation. It hasn't been tended very recently, unfortunately. The executive committee of the Boydton Society, which is formerly the Old Grads, are going down there this weekend to see it. Those that haven't been. We have a pretty good sized group going. And in addition, 2 of the young ladies on the staff up here are going to go and take pictures. And I asked Laura Doherty is one of them. I asked her if they wanted to go back and see the cemetery. And she said, oh, yes. And actually, you can get back to it very easily without going across Dr. Shelton's property. The railroad bed is right there. It's still there. And, of course, railroad beds were built very stably, so it's in good shape. There's a national organization called, and it's passable. You can ride a bicycle on it, you can walk on it, drive a car on it. And so we're going to go back there after the main part of the trip is over, after lunch. And they'll get a chance to take some pictures of it. I haven't seen it. As many times as I've been down there, I haven't been back there. And we would like to get a group of students come down and do a good job of cleaning it up.
We had a fraternity we thought was going to do it, but they dropped the ball. My current thought is that would be a wonderful project for the Bailey Scholars.
It would be. It would be a great project. And about this time of year on is the time to do it, because they've had several killing frosts, so that the bushes that are annuals have died.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be a much easier job cleaning it up.
Yes, Mr.
Yeah.
Bale says you have to come down after the poison ivy and the snakes.
Yes. But I'll get a look at it this weekend, and we'll see what we can do to get somebody down there to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It would be well worthwhile doing.
Mm-hmm.
There are, I don't know how many, but there are several Randolph-Macon students who are buried there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably one or two faculty members.
Yeah, I don't think anybody knows anymore exactly who's buried
No.
in there.
And, you know, the markers on the graves could probably be read.
Some of them can.
Uh,
President Garland's daughter had an infant child buried there. You can
Mhm.
read that one. President Garland. Have I seen it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I was down there with Sigma Phi Epsilon. They were the fraternity we were trying to get to take it on.
mm.
But they've just never had the manpower to do it.
How many Bailey scholars are there? This is off the subject of this interview, but
Probably
12 to 15.
that'd be a good-sized crew. Wouldn't take them long to do it.
Mm-mm. No, and I think if we could get a student group excited about it, it
Mhm.
wouldn't just be the 12 to 15, because they'd have friends who thought that sounded fun. You know, they'd be able to
Mhm.
get some folks going, I think.
Mhm.
We just have to get them excited about it.
like a good publicity from that. Hancock's and
Which got us kind of sort of off the subject of Randolph-Macon, but not a lot. Does anybody else have any questions?
In the time that you were involved with both the alumni and then on the board, those were times of huge change on college campuses with the student body as a whole. Can you kind of describe from your perspective how things changed, how different the students became from when you were a student here?
Oh, law. Things were a lot more simple when I was here. The campus was very small, relatively speaking. It was all in one general location. The bringing in of women, young women, and the building of new dormitories helped the school a lot, I'm sure, in getting students in here. I wasn't actively involved in student life, even as a member of the board. The main connection I had was the fact that Steve Long, Dr. Steve Long, who's now on the Board of Trustees himself, was president of the student body one year, and he sat with the board, and he and I got acquainted, and I've sort of followed him all along from then on, through medical school, and there was more. I'm sure, because there wasn't much when I was here. You know, there was the student body, and there was the administration, and the two didn't meet. The students weren't involved in as far as I could tell, in the administrative side, even in a consulting capacity. And I guess, and you may, looking back at it, colleges in general were different, though, in those days. As the times have changed in general. Students have become much more active and involved in functions and goings on and everything else on campus than they were back when I was there here. We only had 300 students, and I knew every one of them before it was over with. When the student bodies get larger, they do more things. That's about as good. You had as close as I can come to answering the question. I know that, for instance, now they have projects they have to do, community projects. We didn't have any of that in those days. There was very little involvement between the college and the community. There wasn't necessarily the I started to say good feeling, the relationship that there is now. And a lot of that now is, what I did, the result of Bob Lindgren. Apparently he has improved the relationship between the town and the college immensely.
Oh, yes. We've seen that with interviews we've done with townspeople as well.
Any other questions?
Now, you must have a Dr. Moreland story. Everybody has a Dr. Moreland story.
Oh, yes. Did I tell you the other time, I came in here in the fall of 1940. He had come in 39. So my class was the first freshman class after he became president. And from the first assembly we had, and we had chapel 3 times a week. From the first time on, he referred to us as his hand-picked freshman class. And that went on the whole time I was here. Some of those hand-picked ones weren't too good. But
Always a couple bad apples.
yes. Well, there always are, I'm sure. But the boy that lived across the hall from me, I may have told you this. If I did, I'm sorry. Repeat it. Was from up New York, somewhere up in the Northeast, and loved to play lacrosse. And we didn't have a lacrosse team. And he had his lacrosse stick with him, and he'd get out there in the hall and play with it, and fool around. He never studied. He lasted about one semester. That's about it. But he never studied a lick.
At what point would you get kicked out, for lack of a better word? Did you have to maintain a C average, or did you actually have to fail out?
Oh,
Or do you remember?
I think you had to flunk out.
You really did have to flunk?
Yeah, you had to just fail the courses, or fail a majority of them. And that's what happened in this case, I'm sure.
Academic separation. That's what we call it. They don't.
And if you get fired, are you professionally separated?
Could be.
Yes. May we never find out.
I know, may we never find out.
I guess my final question is, with being on the Society of Alumni Board and the Board of Trustees, and now working with the Boyden Society, you have remained active with the college long since graduation. What motivates you to be active with the college?
It may sound sort of mundane, but I guess it's love of the institution. from the time that I first got back involved in it, I have wanted to be involved. I've enjoyed it, and hope it's done. I've been able to contribute to the school in some way. It's sort of old-fashioned to say that I want to give back to the school something that they gave me, but that's about what it is. You go to school here for 3 or 4 years, you can't help but like the place. And even though it's so different now than it was then, another thing too is the opportunity to be involved with people I've known for a long time, and that means a lot. And I want to stay involved as long as I can do it. I don't know how much longer that'll be, but
Hopefully it will be a long time. Well, thank you very much for your time, both days, and in putting this interview together. We've learned a lot, and we appreciate your coming in.
I've enjoyed it thoroughly, really. I didn't know whether I would or not, but it really it's an interesting thing to do. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
If you think of other stories or things or people you want to tell us about, we would love to have them at some
Okay.
point. We would love to hear
If
them.
I think of them, I'll let you know.
That would be
Okay.
terrific.
Let Sarah know.
Oh, thank you so much.